Okay, well, as Colin has already mentioned, I'll be talking about draft infrastructure investment plan. But before I get started, I'll just give you a quick overview of what specifically I'll be talking about. So I'll give you an overview of the IIP, then talk about transport in the IIP. Then I'll talk a bit about comparing high and low carbon investment in the infrastructure investment plans, and then give you transform commentary on this and our proposals for action. So to start out with the overview, the draft infrastructure investment plan 21-22 to 2025-26 was published on the 24th of September. So exactly 2 weeks ago now. It contains 33 billion pounds of investment, of which 24 billion have already been committed. And it was published alongside a partial business and regulatory impact assessment, a strategic environmental assessment, and an interim equality and fair Scotland duty statement. So as I've already mentioned, this is a draft infrastructure investment plan. So that means there's an ongoing consultation that's open until the 19th of November 2020, and the questions for the consultations are contained in the draft IIP, but are also available on the Scottish Government website. So this is the fourth in a series of IIPs. The first one was published in 2008, with the following ones being published in 2011 and in 2015. And in the past, the Scottish Government has published updates on these IIPs every 6 months, so I would expect that that will be happening with this one as well. Overall, these IIPs are meant to set out investment priorities over a longer period of time. So the timescale has varied between these plans, but basically longer term planning than the budget would be. So what's new in this IIP? There are really two main changes. The first one being that there is a new investment hierarchy, which puts determining future need at the top of the hierarchy, and that includes looking at investment priorities in light of climate change forecasts. The second main change is that natural infrastructure is now included in the definition of infrastructure. That is different. Before, the IIPs really only included the built environment. So coming to looking more specifically at transport. So the first three chapters in this IIP are kind of overarching ideas of what the IIP is meant to achieve, but if you actually want to have a look at what specific projects are being prioritized over the next coming years, you will really have to look at chapter 5, 6, and 7, which set out individual projects. There's unfortunately not one place where those transport projects are drawn together, so you have to kind of have a look through all of them individually, but I've made a list of them further along in the presentation. So what does the IIP promise and what does it aim to deliver? So in these first three chapters that I mentioned, the IIP promises to enable net zero emissions and environmental sustainability. There is a commitment to consider appropriate infrastructure provision in light of population and climate change forecasts at the top of the investment hierarchy. And it also accepts the Infrastructure Commission's recommendation to reprioritize the IIP against inclusive net zero carbon economy outcomes. But if you then start looking at the last three chapters in the IIP, which have the individual projects, you'll see that there's no additional funding for low carbon transport projects, aside from what has already been announced, and that the road building program that is set to continue as before. So more specifically, this is the list of projects that is contained in the IIP. I've divided these roughly into low carbon, high carbon. And you'll see that in the low carbon section, you have the 500 million for active travel, bus priority measures, continued investment in low carbon vehicle alternatives in public sector fleets. There's the operation and maintenance of rail, improved rail services, and accessibility to stations in some areas, investment in ferries and ports, improvements to the rail network between Aberdeen and the Central Belt, progressing the rail decarbonisation plan, and then investment in low emission zones. And on the high carbon side, you'll see there's bridge and roads maintenance, the A9 dual link between Perth and Inverness, design and development work to dual the A96, construction of the A77 Maybole bypass, and then improvements to various junctions and investment in the Cross Tailink Road. So what I've also included here is where the Scottish Government has included cost estimates for these individual projects. I've added them into this list, but what you'll see is that except for the bridge and road maintenance, which arguably is revenue rather than capital expenditure, there aren't actually any cost estimates against any of the road building projects in this IIP. So despite the fact that we know that the Scottish Government has produced cost estimates, for instance, for the dualling of the A9 before, so why that isn't in there is a question. Would be a good question. So quite a few on the low carbon transport side. There are several of the projects that do have cost estimates against them, but there are still also a number of them that don't have any cost estimates either. So in the run-up to the IIP being published, we started having a look at historically comparing where Scottish Government investment priorities had been, whether they'd been high or low carbon. And SPICE published this graph in 2018, looking at exactly that, but looking at all infrastructure investment. And we've been using that graph, but really it doesn't quite fit what we want to be looking at, because first of all, it's slightly outdated now, but also it includes all types of infrastructure. And of course, we'd rather just be looking at transport. So we had a go at doing this analysis ourselves, and that then looked like this. The reason why there's no neutral carbon here is that, going by the SPICE methodology, none of the transport projects are in the neutral carbon category. So we did run into quite a few problems with this, though, because basically the data that is available is not consistent over time. So the types of projects that are included in the various IIPs are not necessarily the same. For instance, the reason why low carbon investment in the 2011 IIP is so much higher is because it includes 8 to 9 billion pounds of investment in high-speed rail, which would have been the extension of HS2 into Scotland, which of course wasn't committed at the time and has also not materialized. So it does make it somewhat questionable what is being included and how reliable it is that that investment is actually going to happen. The other problem is that a lot of projects have very unspecific cost estimates, so they have quite a wide range, which isn't very helpful when you're trying to compare. And as you'll also notice, the 2020, so this new draft IIP, is excluded in this comparison, and that's for the reason that I mentioned just now, which is that none of the road building projects actually have cost estimates against them, which makes it almost entirely useless to try and start comparing. So unfortunately, our conclusion from that has been that the lack of consistency and the lack of data make it nearly impossible to make any comparisons across time or between investments in high and low carbon impact projects. And that really also takes us to our transform commentary. So there are a few good things about it. First of all, there's a stronger focus on climate framing. There's commitment to the new investment hierarchy, and also explicitly accepting the Infrastructure Commission's recommendations. and there's continued commitment to previously announced low carbon infrastructure projects, but there's also no new investment. And the large-scale road building projects remain an investment priority despite the new investment hierarchy, which means that really this list of spending priorities remains the same as it has been in the past years. And that really makes it clear that all the first three chapters talking about accepting the Infrastructure Commission's recommendations and the new investment hierarchy are really nothing more than warm words. And it's maybe also worth mentioning here that this IAP was published alongside the Strategic Environmental Assessment, which unfortunately only looks at the first three chapters, really, looking at what the framework is for the IIP and assesses that, but it doesn't seem to assess the individual project or whether there has been any changes in that. So it takes a very positive view of the IIP, despite the fact that really there is still a high priority on high carbon infrastructure projects. And then finally, the inconsistency in which projects have been included in IIPs in the past and which haven't makes it really impossible to compare spending priorities across times, and the really wide range of projects from committed projects to really what appear to be wish list projects that are included in the IIPs seem to be obscuring the purpose of the IIP as such. And so that takes me to the last part, our proposals for action. So first of all, we're planning on preparing a detailed commentary on how the draft infrastructure investment plan addresses or fails to address really the climate crisis and its own commitments to more sustainable infrastructure investment. We'll obviously be responding to the draft infrastructure investment plan consultation. And we'll also be seeking clarification on estimated cost for the road building program that's contained in the IIP. And then I've already discussed the analysis that we've done of high and low carbon infrastructure investment, but we are looking at pursuing that further and potentially looking at output rather than projected investment as a way of looking at where the Scottish government has spent its money in the past years. And then finally, we're looking at preparing an alternative IIP, and that I really have to pass over to Colin there because while he has told me that that we'll be looking at that, we've not had an opportunity to really discuss that in detail. So if you have any questions about that, really those will have to be directed at Colin. And well, that's really it. And I'll hand back to Matt with that so we can have a discussion and any questions. Thanks.